Now, entitled this slide, Epistemologies. How do we handle or grapple with complexity as it is currently being theorized now? What could anthropologists draw from it? What could we contribute back to the discourse on complexity theory? Well, we have been looking at this seemingly contradictory nature of human behavior in groups, considering, for instance, as key examples, the one question I'm often asked in discussions about Filipino culture. Why is it that Filipinos love to run the red light? Yun. So it points out as very fundamental, everyday, and yet real, but perhaps very illustrative example of the contrariness of human behavior and decision making, which is an illustration of complexity. On the one hand, you have the ideal rule, the red light. And the accompanying rules, you stop at the red light, you move when it's green. And then you have the everyday contingent behavior. People run the red light. Now you don't get to understand why, or you can reduce your explanation to simply saying Pinoys love to break rules, which is oversimplistic, until you realize the context in which a red light can be safely run. One of them, there's nobody approaching from the other end. 2, there's no law enforcer around to arrest you. 3, the traffic enforcer themselves will tell you to cross the red light because there is nobody crossing from the other side. It's a means of reducing traffic volume and build up an intersection. Suddenly, contradictions begin to resolve themselves. There is a certain order after all. The question is defining that order in the first place, and maybe the units that we use would include value systems, rules, etc. What happens then is that culture isn't so much an entity, but a set of pragmatic guidelines, a framework in which humans exercise their agency or the ability to act freely. I should perhaps have expanded that slide to tell you that it's not just seemingly the random choices, but also the contradictory ones. Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, came to this point years ago when he began to develop his habitus theory, while exploring also the limits of structuralism and the ways in which humans move and behave in between binary oppositions. He began to realize that human behavior is actually more contingent on daily realities rather than simply being rule-bound. And so complexity theory also takes us to another level of theorizing about behavior by pointing out and bringing out the contingencies people are subject to. And of course, I'm sorry, I'll just go on this. Now, on one hand, in trying to understand culture, there has been a reductionist program borrowing from the physical sciences in orientation and methodology. So in many of our anthro textbooks, you will find the breaking down of this everyday behavior into chapters. The textbook tells you how people think about culture. The chapters, social organization, religion, human evolution, etc. The other stream of thought has been to examine culture as a set of processes, such that culture is not a static series of categories, but a dynamic integrated phenomenon. So in describing a cultural phenomenon, like religion, it's not only enough to describe the rituals, but also the lives of the participants, the flow of events, the created meanings, and everything else enacted by all those who share in the life of the community. Both ends of the methodological spectrum are actually ways to describe the complexity of daily life. Such approaches are informed by the standpoints or influences of the researcher. And so here, in a sense, perhaps we're echoing some of that age-old debates between the positivists and postmodernists. And so complexity is actually both a familiar and a new animal to the zoo of anthropological models and methods. Since where our focus has always been about making sense of the daily and unpredictable behavior of humans, we realize that each action, each decision is unique and at the same time contingent on other events. And what fuels the sense of contingency is the recognition that at their core, humans are basically unpredictable beings. And so here, That the world is complex and can seem chaotic is already given in most cultural settings. And so this chaotic setting is seen as something that must be controlled and given shape. And in the origins of most cultures, we begin with a master narrative in the beginning. And so most cultures recognize that in the beginning all was chaos. And all the cultures, everything their life ways had to do with mastering that chaos, making sense out of it, and reducing and controlling the uncontrollable flow of events to something they can handle. Now, I drew attention to these because you have creating master narratives, and in a way, perhaps complexity is starting to turn into another form of master narrative for the social sciences. Something we also have to be familiar with, both as a tool, be flexible with, and at the same time, something to be on guard against as a possible trap, pushing us only into one particular way of thinking. Complexity is built on iteration. Recurring events, not of all of which are exactly the same as the one before, although each event builds on the previous one. Culture is built on not only out of the shared patterns of behavior, but also out of these contingent choices of the individuals, right? While people may operate within these shared patterns, there is enough variation such that even these cultural patterns begin to reflect changes. To elaborate this, I've mentioned the concept of iteration in complexity, and so culture has its own set of iterations, repeated events that are not going to be the same all throughout. Think of it this way. Culture unfolds before us not in a linear manner, but in a spiral manner. Patterns that govern behavior are there to handle their complexities, but their iterations may, following a general template, may nevertheless change, sometimes in context, sometimes unpredictably. Culture is built up not only out of the shared patterns of behavior, but also out of the choices made by individuals. And so because of that feedback effect between individual choices, we have to pay attention to the concept of agency. Any concept of culture that we can build upon, draw upon to handle, to address the issues of complexity has to pay attention to agencies, the role of individuals as decision makers. Well, we recognize that human agency is basically unpredictable, and this unpredictability is in turn rooted upon human self-consciousness. Each and every point, each and every event, there happens to be a wide spectrum of possibilities. We have actually a trinary choice. One is to conform, the one is to resist or to go into conflict, or the other one is to institute change. Now, this is just a very brief overview of how anthropology would perhaps react to the concept of complexity, both at the same time embracing a concept as a new tool for developing further research and application, at the same time as a concept for subject to its own internal critique from our own field. The possibilities are, of course, very wide-ranging, both in terms of understanding daily contingencies, such as in medical anthropology, when we want to understand how illnesses, complexities of daily life of health disrupt behavior. And methods include not just simply the qualitative description, but in perhaps giving another way to handle large sets of data and therefore providing anthropology with a wider range of, or wider field in which to move in. Since this recognizes human agency, therefore, we want to avoid the limitation of being what we often feel is the limitation of exclusively quantitative research by allowing for the basic unpredictability of human individuals. I can't go further into any more examples here. So next slide, please. This one. Okay, that's the last one. We want to think, the last part, I mentioned earlier how we would apply this in concrete terms, such as in medical anthropology. How do we understand illness, for instance? Illness as a complex event that is very disruptive, that forces unwanted changes upon people, not just upon the ill individual, but also upon those around that person. I would perhaps speak from personal experience in this case because someone very close to me has undergone and narrowly averted a life-threatening illness. but the disruption caused by an unwanted event brought about its own set of complex actions and reactions. What are we to make of that? As an anthropologist, I realize I'm acting within my own cultural setting, but at the same time, I'm also acting as an individual agent. With that, I'll end my presentation. Thank you for taking time to listen. Good day to everyone.
Thank you so much to all the speakers. The rest of this morning will now be devoted to the open forum. I believe everybody's been looking forward to that. Initially, I was asked to give a very quick reaction, and I'll do that maybe in half a minute, and then I'll invite Professor Michael Tan to do the same. And then Professor Tan will moderate the open forum. So I believe we can treat the discussion more of a conversation, because we have a rather intimate circle of people now. So anyway, this was the intention, to have a real conversation among all of us, so that we can express common interests and understanding. Okay, before we invite the audience for questions, I was asked to react very quickly to the talks of Professors Poblador and Concepcion. And just to give my reaction in half a minute, like I said, I just sort of wanted to mention that at the present time, the field of complexity is becoming very mathematical. There is a large effort all over the world to actually collect real data and to try to extract patterns from the data using mathematical tools. I'd like to mention maybe just 3 examples. One is the example of cancer, which Dr. Concepcion mentioned in her talk. One reason cancer is so difficult to treat is because cancer cells are very unique and heterogeneous. And then they interact within the milieu of the body's environment. And then they give rise to new patterns, which medical science has been having difficulty keeping up with. So that's the example of cancer. The other example is banking systems. So there are actually networks of institutions through which money flows, and there are vigorous research efforts now to understand why the financial systems collapse. And then, in the process, to be able to suggest better means of regulation. And the third example is, of course, what Professor Nick alluded to, which is crowd control. So how, obviously, individuals like Adolf Hitler were able to understand the underpinnings of individual decisions, which then merge together into what looks like group behavior, and then to manipulate this to affect societal change. So the field of complexity has been at work even at that time. Okay, that's just my very quick reaction. May I now invite Professor Tan to give his reactions and then begin the open forum proper. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yap. Also very brief. And my response really is mainly to say that I think it was important to have this session. It's a breakthrough in the sense that we are talking transdisciplinary. We've been having some deliberations, the General Education Council, and the consensus is that we should move towards transdisciplinary GE courses rather than keeping the silos of natural sciences, social sciences, and arts and humanities. And I remember there was the question, what is transdisciplinarity? What's the difference between that and interdisciplinary? And just to be sure we're on the same page, interdisciplinary is, let's say, within the College of Science, you have the bio people talking with the chem people. But transdisciplinary is you talk across the colleges, which is what we're doing today. It was quite fascinating how you had the whole spectrum: biology, physics, literature, linguistics, anthro, business, ad, economics, demography. And that even Neil's poem was actually marine sciences, right? It was about the sea.
I chose one with a lot of natural stuff.
Yes. So, can I ask whose poem that was? Was that yours?
Yeah.
The Gift. Okay, so that was Neil. He was very modest. There was no byline in there.